in this conference that join us today. And we are gathering together in two academic events that are taking place in chained way. This week in Mexico City at the UNAM, the National University in Mexico, and next week in Boston here, we're united by a reflection on war reason. From the Beyond Global Violence Initiative project, the Boston College Department of Theology, we clearly see the urgency of thinking in a very collaborative way and as an interdisciplinary work, ways to address the systemic violence that afflicts humanity, particularly vulnerable people and communities in all latitudes of the planet, especially in the global south, which I prefer to call global and epistemic south. This project was born last year in Boston College as a bid to promote a decolonial theology that is a critical thinking of the Christian faith in dialogue with other sapiential, spiritual, and religious traditions of humanity, all of them focused on the experience and promotions of peace with justice and dignity. The core of the colonial theology is found, in fact, in naming, critically thinking also about the praxis of resilient victims who overcome these processes of victimization and resist in different ways, creating other ways of being beyond violence, opening the way to human divine redemption. We started this process by listening carefully to the experience and reflection of various collectives that we have listed in the first phase of this project. First of all, the Puerto Rican women in resistance to patriarchy, then the mothers of disappeared persons in Mexico, followed by the Afro-diasporic communities in Brazil, and finally, the undocumented immigrants in the United States and their struggle for social visibility. We people from academia, social societies, and churches, we are learning to walk with survivors, to create and strengthen ways of conflict resolution, transitional justice, and open the horizon of a possible reconciliation. Reconciliation is only an horizon, is never the beginning, the starting point. So that's why all of you are mostly welcome in this second part of the project Beyond the Global Violence Initiative. Let me present briefly the connection with the international workshop Critique of War Reason, prepared by Professor Donovan Hernández at UNAM. This is an international workshop, or Semillero. There's no translation to English for this word, but the relevance is to contribute to the critique of the war reason. This is the objective of this international workshop, from the resistances of those who suffer violence and the analysis of the ideological justifications that sustain war reason. Over the course of 3 days, this workshop will explore elements in the search for justice, such as forensic investigation as an accompaniment to victims, the role of journalism in the face of militarism in Eastern Europe, the rhetoric of hate as an echo of mimetic violence, the relationship between the proliferation of weapons and hegemonic masculinities, and other issues of applied ethics. The context of militarized lives and societies denotes an underlying problem, which is the correlation between human rights violations and the logic of capital accumulation, or extractivist capitalism. For all these reasons, thinking about the paths to peace is an uncertain but necessary route where the experience of peoples in resistance, as has happened in Colombia in the last decades, will help us to think differently in order to promote what we call here a performative praxis of peace. So we are pleased to start this colloquium this research colloquium towards political theology in times of necropower, welcoming Professor Donovan Hernández. With this, his initial lecture on the critique of war reason, we begin our conversation at Boston College. And now I give the floor to Martin Aguilera, research assistant at BC, for the introduction of our guest. Please, Martin.
Thank you, Professor Mendoza. I welcome everyone. It seems we've been having some issues with the Zoom link, but it is getting people in the room anyway, so I hope everyone can join us. And thank you for being here again. Professor Donovan Hernández Castellano has a PhD in philosophy from UNAM and carried out a postdoctoral work on post-colonial studies at Autonomy University of Mexico. He teaches philosophy at the Faculty of Philosophy and Letters of the National Autonomous University of Mexico and is part of the Academic Council of Cultura, TH. He's the author of 4 books, the most recent of which are Urban Archaeologies, Critical Topographies, The Dialectic of the City in Siegfried Krauher and Walter Benjamin, and The Earth Color, Chronicles from the Autonomy. He also wrote the article Freedom for Routledge Publishers, Volume 2, series key topic, Rethinking the Americas, and has participated in the Sonorous Art of Berlin Radical Sounds Latin America. He was a panelist at the CBEAT seminar, Critical Thought Against the Capitalist Hydra, convened by the Zapatist Army of National Liberation, Chiapas, and was invited observer at the 5th National Indigenous Congress. He has published various educational materials on human rights and contemporary arts, as well as opinion articles. He has been a visiting professor by the Human Rights Commission of the state of Quintana Roo, the National Human Rights Commission, and has lectured in Berlin, Colombia, Chile, Cuba, and Argentina, among others. We welcome Professor Donovan and thank you for your presence.
Thank you so much for this.
Sorry, we have this. Well, I want to thank to Carlos Mendoza for this conversation between our other centers.
We cannot hear you clearly. Sorry for that.
Well, we have an echo situation. Oops, sorry. Well, I wanna say thank you for this opportunity, for this conversation, and we will begin. I have write some theses about these aspects I wish to depart with you, and I called it a critic of war reason. Naturally, this
Vamos a cerrar esto y hablar un poco. Ahí también cerrar el micrófono.
Lo voy a decir en español. Educación Continua tiene abierto el micrófono, así es que tiene que cerrarlo.
No problem. Can you hear me? Sorry. There's no problem, right?
No, Donovan, no
Eso-
podemos oírte.
El micrófono de antes estaba funcionando bien. El problema era que el micrófono de educación continua estaba encendido. Si vuelven a poner el micrófono con la cuenta de Daniel,
Okay.
we apologize for the inconvenience. We are figuring out a problem with the microphone. We will be
We're fixing the problem is that we cannot see Donovan when he speaks with the Daniel Lozada account. So we are going to connect another microphone
we can
In
now
the
hear you very
beginning-
well.
so we can see and listen to Donovan in the same window.
Dear Chima, we can hear you pretty well now.
Just please give us a few seconds. Can you hear us now? Yes.
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Few seconds, please.
Al inicio, cuando estuvieron con el micrófono inicial abierto, estaba bien, se oía muy bien. El problema era de educación continua estaba abierto.
Solo que y el micrófono abierto de la cuenta de Daniel, no podemos ver a Donovan en pantalla porque solo vemos
Bueno.
la pantalla de
Si
que
encuentras la solución, te agradeceremos.
Pero nosotros sí lo vemos cuando el micrófono de Daniel está abierto.
¿Puedes hablar, Donovan, por favor?
¿Escuchar claramente?
Si hablas más, intentamos.
¿Me escuchan por ahí? Probando, 1, 2, 3.
Se escucha bajo todavía.
Abajo. Lo subo un poco más. Tal vez si subo la voz. Ahí.
No es la cuenta de Daniel, es la cuenta de...
¿Por qué no usamos el micrófono donde estabas hablando, Chima? Y nosotros estamos viendo a Donovan. Así es que usamos ambos.
el problema es que en la transmisión en vivo no se ve la ventana de Donovan.
Bueno, pues quizá es más importante primero que lo escuchemos y luego podemos verlo cuando conversemos.
Entonces,
Well, tengo este micrófono abierto y suena un lag que...
Está mejor.
Sí, mucho mejor. De todas formas hay un lag. ¿Listo? Ahí todavía se escucha lag aquí en la sala. Eso puede afectar como la transmisión. ¿No?
¿Tienen alguna...
Aquí ya no tiene abierto Zoom, ¿verdad? Mm. Uno, dos. 1, 2, 3. Enciendo el micrófono de Daniel.
Apagándolo. ¿Pueden escuchar a Donovan?
Te escuchamos a ti, pero no a Donovan. ¿Por qué no le pasas tu micrófono a Donovan, aunque no lo veamos? Tenemos que seguir.
Sí, ya lo tiene. El tema es que ya lo tiene.
Pero ¿por qué te escuchamos bien a ti y a él no? ¿Desde dónde nos estás hablando tú, Chima?
Desde la computadora, pero Donovan tiene un micrófono que está conectado a la cámara, que es desde donde tendría que salir el audio.
El problema es que hace un eco. Y si le pasas la computadora, o Donovan se va donde estás tú, aunque no lo veamos.
Yo paso la computadora.
Quita el volumen a la computadora. Que no los parlantes estén apagados y probablemente no haya eco.
Perdón que me meta, pero cuando hay dos computadoras en el mismo lugar se hace ese tipo de situaciones de ecos.
Sí, desgraciadamente, Sofía. Saludos. Gracias por...
Saludos.
Listo, apagué, quité el audio de una sola computadora y dejé otra. ¿Se escucha más claramente?
Adelante.
Perfecto. Estaré leyendo esta conferencia en una computadora y trataré de hablar más directamente hacia el otro. Well, I will read the lecture in one computer and I will try to talk to the other. Well, thank you for this opportunity. Sorry for this inconvenience. The technology always goes in a different way that our own wishes. So I have write these 20 theses in a spirit very close to Walter Benjamin thesis on the philosophy of history, and I call them a critic of world reason. Let's begin. First thesis. For Max Weber, all social action can be understood as a form of rationality. An ideal form, of course, does not exist empirically, but is an heuristic category that allows us to guide the theoretical debate. In the 20th century, Michel Foucault expanded on this viewpoint by means of a pluralist thesis that deals with the thought systems implied in government practices and the diagrams of power. Our civilization's rationalization processes are part of these thought systems. It is possible to affirm that there is a type of rationality that we could define as world reason. For some time, philosophy assumed that there was an opposition between reason and violence. Today, we know that barbarism is exercised by rational means. Our duty is to dismantle the rational schemes implied in the irregular warfare forms that our societies suffer. Second thesis, world reason designates a paradoxical subtype of political reason. First, because our culture tends to believe that war as a military activity is subordinate to diplomacy, understood as a political activity. In turn, the regular practice of war is regulated by international law, which has courts, protocols, and humanitarian instruments to tame the savage aspect of state sovereignty. In this sense, regular warfare would be a regulated activity and its belligerents would be constrained within legal frameworks. Everything that constitutes what is located outside the law would thus be perceived as savage, primitive, and the exotic and regressive element of barbarism. It is still common to find in the specialized bibliography expressions, such as the heated violence of the furious savages against the cold violence of civilized countries. But what happens when we face the fact that 3/4 of the world suffers in some way from irregular war practices? What will be its relation to the law when it comes to conflict that take place manifestly outside the normative regulation of its instruments? In the vast majority of cases, neither the actors nor the weapon used are supervised by any state apparatus. These war machines are often transversal to the state and its legitimate power. Rosana Reguillo, for example, has discussed the case of Mexico, showing a shift from the narco machine, which functions as an illegal but utilitarian capitalist enterprise, to the necro machine, where the absolute dissolution of life in a state of constant urgency is the norm. Third thesis. I would like to argue against the normative vision of politics that irregular warfare and the persistence of armed conflicts obey a type of rationality that we can call warlike, even and especially when it is not a matter of confrontation between regular armies or between sovereign states. There would be, then, a system of rationality and a rationalization of the liminal field of armed violence, of massacre, and its parastate, paralegal, infra or supralegal, infra or suprapolitical logics. I would like to analyze this type of rationality as a power device. Fourth thesis. The defining feature of war reason consists in transferring the logic of armed confrontation to every dispute over political power, or, as Pablo Reina has aptly put it, war reason is the hegemonic mode of our political ontology, which replaces the dimensions of conflict and democratic agonism in the scheme of armed confrontation with its politics of enmity. To a large extent, war has become the grid for interpreting Latin American contemporary history and the current post-colonial condition of countries such as Indonesia, Pakistan, and Eastern Europe. The general political diagram of war rationality that must be assumed in any armed conflict that seeks to fight over political power can be exemplified by plotting coup d'etat, the introduction of neoliberal policies, the techniques of forced disappearances, the emergence of death squads and masters of war, forced displacement, and colonial plunder to greater or lesser extent. I want to show that behind every massacre, we do not only encounter the criminal calculation of instrumental violence, but the incalculability of sovereign power that manifestly produces horror. Sovereignty, contrary to Agamben's thesis, not only produces confusion between de facto and de jure, it produces rather an excess, the variegated waste of a barbaric logic of jouissance, plus de jouissance as Lacan calls it. Horror is an excrescence and a supplement of sovereignty. This makes the necropolitical device seem absolutely irrational from some perspectives, but it is by no means so. The 20th century showed us that reason coexists with its excesses. Fifth thesis. One of the main components of war reason is the implementation of a politics of enmity. As we know, this policy does not only make use of stereotyping, which in general is used by racism and sexism, among other discriminatory practices. Enmity is an inchoate relationship that makes use of all kinds of hate practices to establish an abyss within the realm of the sensible. From a certain moment and a certain place, the chronos and the topos of the enemy are implemented, who is no longer a simple otherness, but a factor that must be eliminated. It is a return to a dialectic of survival without the acknowledgement of the other. 6. Today, the grammar of enmity implements a sui generis syntax of cruelty. If the discourse of hatred gives way to the ethical and aesthetic representation of the other as an enemy, cruelty establishes a latent disjunction between the victim and the victimizer. Perhaps the most brutal dimension of post-conflict is the moment when the clear distinction cannot be sustained with such precision. The scansion of the executioner is the inevitable step. Against all odds, again, we do not find here a merely instrumental logic. War reason implements a device of excess and waste that goes beyond rational calculation, which has earned it at times the nickname of Baroque. He who exercises sovereignty de facto often shows a frightening confidence in his own strength. He shows himself to be overconfident. He laughs at his victim, whom he imagines to be defenseless, torturing him psychologically. In addition, to inflict extreme punishment and bodily suffering, almost always keeping him in that state of suspension that is between life and death. The executioner plants images in the victim's psychic apparatus, attacking him at the level of fantasy, wielding, in short, a power over life and death. This power usually seeks to justify itself in some epic, typically masculinist account of power. This story, from which, unfortunately, not even utopias are exempt, appeals to the need for unrestricted sacrifice, for the indefinite postponement of pleasure, to death, in short, as an inevitable and insurmountable necessary horizon. Even violent death is aestheticized as a source of honor, worthiness, or transcendence. In this sense, the economy of warlike reason is perfectly uneconomic. 7. In order for war reason to operate its mechanisms, in addition to the frontal enemy, it must make use of substitute and supplementary figures that we could call disposable lives, as the French psychoanalyst Bertrand Ogilvy defines them. Within the logic of extermination, there are always secondary victims who, for reason of class, sex, race, or disability, are seen as a surplus and thus dispensable bodies, lives that hardly count from a biological perspective and are not even important in symbolic terms, lives on the margins of the representation, that do not count, as Gabriel Gatti has exposed. The necropolitical power mechanisms of war reason exploit these surpluses and implement an organization aimed at eliminating them. The false positive in Colombia, for example, were implemented by the army by picking up peasants, vagrants, supposedly young drug addicts, or young people who were simply precarious, who were offered a job to move them to the open field so they could be riddled with bullets, with the aim of justifying their murders as casualties of the enemy front in an armed confrontation. The same thing happens with the mechanisms of social cleansing of those disposable elements who were killed by the police, military, paramilitary, and even by the guerrillas, because they disfigured the cities. Investigation of these crimes against humanity have shown that the drug flow was almost always accompanied by the arrival of members of the legal, paralegal, or illegal forces in the communities damaged by the exterminating violence. The legal authority produces its supplement, its oberts, and its excrescents, which it seeks to strip of all its humanity in order to make its suppression tolerable. Eighth, a fourth constitutive factor of war reason is the structural impunity that the executors of necropolitics have. This impunity is often guaranteed by the collusion that exists between criminal groups, public officials, and the highest ranking authorities, both civilian and military. Paramilitary groups often benefit from these agreements in high political spheres, where it is not uncommon for them to enjoy the favor of the local business class and carry out the state's dirty work. An example of this is the selective assassination of journalists, human rights defenders, social leaders, and defenders of territory and natural resources. It is impossible to implement necropolitics without the structural impunity of public and private institutions subordinated to war reason. My hypothesis is that this impunity is guaranteed by the legal division between civilian courts and military courts. As long as the military power is not forced to answer before civilian institutions and there is no transparency in the activities of military barracks, it will be impossible to break the fence of violence that constitutes the sovereign gesture. The independence of the military power, regardless of whether there are progressive or honest forces among its troops, only underpins the waste of the death drive. The independence of the courts is a prop of structural impunity and, as such, is a form of violence to the highest degree. The army should not only pay allegiance to the president, but to the entire citizenry. 9. Casualties. A politics of death can quickly become politics of the dead. Once the relationship of enmity between the different sides is established, vendettas are part of the confrontation's moral economy. Enmity as a device has the effect of simplifying the political antagonism between the contenders and morally flattering the enemy. The world of war reason knows neither claroscuro nor nuances. It has renounced any manifestation of imagination that do not translate into strategies of slaughter. It does not care about judgments so indispensable for political life. It only understands that sovereign gesture. Casualties on the fronts, which are virtually any city or countryside, are usually translated into the rhetoric of martyrology, only that, unlike the Christianity, the new martyr does not succumb for defending a revealed truth that would account for the community of souls, for example. On the contrary, the martyr of the enmity device counts as a casualty who, in the eyes of this confraternity, justifies and legitimizes the renewed impetus of the endless violence, which preexists the deaths of both regular and irregular combatants. The casualties on every front are the gasoline of the executioners. Mourning, instead of being a healing process and a way of dealing with irremediable loss, becomes more desolated and ritualistic violence. 10. The excess of violence, the fighting almost always takes place in the civilian infrastructure, which will justify the nickname of terrorist acts, were it not for the fact that this notion has already been appropriated by the power apparatus of war reason. These are all sorts of attacks on radio stations, car bombs, and main thoroughfares, hostage-taking in crowded cafes, entertainment centers, or even financial and government buildings. Enemy violence is punitive and perceives itself as a corrective practice, a kind of corrective orthopedics. But even when it is an unconventional military tactic, its destruction is random and collateral damage is inherent. During some clashes with the army, Las FARC, the guerrilla in Colombia, used dynamite-filled gas pipes to replace the destructive potential of mortars. The ballistic structure of the pipes made it impossible to aim them adequately to their pre-established martial target. If the guerrillas aimed, for example, at a government building, there was no guarantee that the projectile would hit its target with certainty. Instead, it randomly hit civilian homes and workplaces. Only the whistling of the precarious missile alerted the inhabitants that from that moment on, they had only a few seconds to find shelter. No one could have predicted where the gas container would land. Thousands of non-combatants lost their lives in these clashes that are beyond any tactical and military calculation. This shows that the violence of armed confrontation goes beyond objective and instrumental calculation and goes beyond the pleasure principle. The survival of landmines in the Colombian countryside, even when the guerrillas and the army have withdrawn from the confrontation scenes, is one of the crimes against humanity that has had the biggest number of mutilations in Latin America. No civilian should have to deal with the harrowing legacy of the battles, which steered the entire social fabric in the post-conflict transition. 11th, a main factor of the device of cruelty and the politics of enmity is the masculinism of its sovereign gesture. As Sayak Valencia has pointed out, in Latin American societies, the quest to preserve the social type of the macho provider in order to confront the rise of women in public and economic life has not only incurred in orthopedic violence, which seeks to reintegrate a supposed natural and true gender order, but in the context in which it is articulated with a biomarket that puts a price on human lives, it becomes a viable route to follow for young people in a state of poverty and institutional abandonment. Valencia calls them endriagos subjects, like the monsters of the Middle Age who live on the other side of civilization, in the liminal areas of the maps of which there is no longer a reliable record of the territory and its ominous inhabitants. The young hitmen, the hawks, and the other subjects employed by criminal networks belong to this type of endriagos subjectivities, who seek to climb the social ladder through necro-empowerment, that is, by turning the practice of murdering other human beings into a remunerated activity, thus transforming death and life into commodities of a bio-necro market that extrapolates the logic of capital accumulation to the valorization of extermination skills. These hyper-violent ways of preserving the role of the male provider and the patriarchal ordering of the social bond are also ways in which young men deprived of any opportunity for development seek to reiterate the dominant norm of masculinity. This is characterized, among other things, by its cold disregard for life, hostility towards any form of emotional and discursive conflict resolution skills, as well as a high valuation of action, risk, and extreme situations where its participants can show their manhood, which they hope will be confirmed and acknowledged by the brotherhood of men who, in the 21st century, aspire to have a glorious death. A thanatic form that parodized the Spartan aesthetics of the beautiful death to a grotesque extent. 12. Evidently, young people who embody the endriago subjects are aware of the reification of which they are subjected and of the alienation that has separated them from their lives and their bodies. Mexican anthropologist Rosana Reguillo interviewed a young hitman who told her when she asked if he ever thought about his own death, that he wants his body to be chopped out to spare his mother the pain of searching for him. The hardening before his own life, this ideation of a death that remedies the mourning through the certainty of the remains, at the same time that he fantasizes about the complete loss of the body's integrity, speaks both of an authoritarian personality that respects authority for the power it has over life and death, and of a self-alienation in which the young hitman sees it as extremely necessary to repress any emotion capable of making him seem fragile or vulnerable before his interviewer, for example. Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno suggested in the 20th century that part of what made an industrial machinery of extermination possible in Auschwitz was, on the one hand, fostering a personality that represses its feelings and hardens in the face of tears, and, on the other, that the mechanisms of persecution and extermination consist in attacking precisely those lives that are socially perceived as happier and fuller than our own. In this way, the philosopher suggests those who seem to have the thing that will make us enjoy are persecuted. Thus, the dialectic of the monster that seeks to take rather than to understand comes to an end. A cycle that does not seek the immediate satisfaction of its impulses, but the warlike justification of its indefinite procrastination. 13. The dialectic of the monster. Valencia's thesis on the Endriago subject has been criticized for allegedly reproducing the exotization of marginal youth and putting precarious youth in the place of an inhuman otherness, in the place of the monster. But it is not true that unusual and seemingly inexplicable acts of violence are often described as acts perpetrated by monsters. From the Nazi lager to the death squads in Indonesia, from the DINA in Chile to the patotas in the military dictatorship of the South America, from the mercenary militias in the former Yugoslavia to the bombing in Gaza and the femicides that regularly take place in Mexico. All acts perpetrated by a violence that goes beyond the logic of means and to an end are perceived as monstrous acts that, in short, mark an absolute limit for humanity, but which, for that very reason, escape all possible description and all efforts to understand them. Even the effort to understand them is seen as something dangerous, harmful, as a disturbing way of crossing that thin line that separates the socially acceptable form, its overwhelming transgression, establishing a boundary from which there is no longer any possibility of returning, as if common sense wanted to armor itself by expelling brutality outside the realm of the everyday life and its ordinary context. Whoever seeks to understand the monstrosity of violence is perceived as a monster himself, which establishes a sort of transitional effect from his object of inquiry. The truth is that considering these acts as madness or monster only guarantees their impunity and perpetration. It contributes in any case to fostering the idea that these outbursts of rage arise randomly and spontaneously without any apparent cause. The dialectic of the monster needs to be explored further. In his Anthropology of Violence, Wolfgang Sofsky has considered homicidal acts and forms of violence that silence us as a way of overcoming the fear of our finitude. If we transfer death to the other, we can momentarily suspend the fear of dying. We can even contingently overcome it through the gregarious feeling of being part of a primitive horde, which is part of the mainly male communities of violence. Whether individually or collectively, murder and the outbreak of sovereign violence requires an effective community capable of temporarily overcoming the fear of death. Naturally, this can only be achieved at a great cost and not without much hesitation, for there is a line, a normative limit to which one cannot return. Levinas considered that limit to be the phase, only the phase which dictates the imperative, "Thou shalt not kill." It can also turn the experience of the neediness of the other into a call to genocidal violence. This is shown by the different stories of young hitmen anxious to obtain the commander-in-chief's approval, hesitate and face the naked and solitary fact of becoming executioners. To do so, they have to radically dehumanize their victims. We know that euphemisms are part of and not the least of every extermination agenda. In Rwanda, ethnic hatred used the term cockroaches to brutalize and derealize the humanity of the population considered to be the enemy. Perhaps this need to overcome the fear of death is at the genesis of the act of killing. Joshua Oppenheimer's famous documentary on that subject features two former members of the Indonesia death squads who hunted down, tortured, and massacred dissidents and communists during the extermination policy that took place between 1965 and 1966. Unlike Eichmann, who was both a literary subject and a careerist bureaucrat, completely lacking in imagination, the subjects interviewed by Oppenheimer were illiterate, uneducated, and from the working class of Indonesia. These people saw in genocidal violence a chance to gain social recognition and climb the ladder during their youth. They are puerile people, incapable of morally judging their actions, always making up strategies to avoid doing so. This repressed imagination, this lack of capacity for judgment, is precisely what Hannah Arendt defined as the banality of evil, because for there to be empathy, there must be first imagination. Arendt's arguments are based on the hold of Kantian legacy of the critic of judgment. To show the importance of the capacity to judge in political life, it is not a question here of reflective judgments, but of determinative judgments. Determinative judgment, do not kill, is a hypothetical imperative that comes from a source external to the subject. To desire a world where there will be no homicide is a maxim chosen by the subject, and it is a determinant, unconditional judgment. Towards the end of his documentary, Oppenheimer shows one of these Endriago subjects who acts paradise and gives asylum in his body to a simulated representation of the acts of torture he inflicted on the bodies of his victims. Something changed for him by giving asylum, hospitality to the suffering of the other in his own body. That night, the executioner is plagued by nightmares in which he has to defend himself from his victims, claims from the return of the specters. The specter comes back to haunt him, to demand the moral and political judgment that he insisted on repressing. From then on, the good conscience of the murderer abandoned him. The power of parodic acts should never be underestimated. 14 thesis. Avi Warburg, the famous image theorist, was obsessed towards the end of his life by the motto per monstra ad astra, from the monsters to the spheres, which could easily define the dialectic of monsters. Among the Renaissance fascination with the forms of classical and ancient pathos, the pathos formel, the obsession with mancia, divination, and even the belief in the influence of the stars on life stands out. In these imaginaries, the monster or demons, for example, are obstacles that prevent you from ascending to the highest spheres of the spirit. But once defeated, they can become potential and powerful allies in the work of civilizational ascent. Monsters are important guides in cultural terms. Warburg suggests that this dialectic shows the civilization translation from taking greifen to understanding begreifen, a dialectic that distances men from his primordial instincts and shifts libidinal energy to the world of the concept. To substitute the violent gesture of taking and snatching from the world for its distant comprehension is also an effort to give form to chaos, to work with the primordial and amorphous background of the gesture and the sovereign tribes, capable of dismembering from the excess of the sacred human bodies and to substitute this chaotic violence for the search for form. The dialectic of the monster, the transition from splitting to understanding, from replacing primordial chaos with form, is never a linear or progressive task. It is not an ascending path because there is always the risk of regression. The monster that leads the way can also betray, and it is important to know that there is such a risk. But at the same time, there is nothing comparable to the guidance of ex-combatants, hired killers, and executioners when it comes to understanding the mechanisms of war reason and the sovereign gesture that is concomitant to them. As Oppenheimer's documentaries have shown, as well as Everardo González, La Libertad del Diablo, among others, the stories and testimonies of former members of groups that displayed exterminist violence are crucial, not only to clearly know the facts, but also to understand the motives, mechanisms, and springs that drive subjects to reify the other and themselves, which becomes their main survival strategy. These works can and should be counterpointed by other materials, such as Tempestad by Tatiana Hueso, where survivors and relatives of victims of the war on drugs in Mexico show their strategies to overcome the loss of their loved ones, either by seeking justice for their cases or by appealing to the right to forget the damages of the past. The artistic form makes it possible to introduce this mediation, the vindication of criteria for ordering the experience of extreme violence, which allows us to differ and distance our confrontation from the amorphous and chaotic background of the human condition. The experience that borders on the edge of the real is sovereign. 15. There are three possible genealogies of war reason, of its devices and morphologies that we are interested in highlighting here. All of them come from the context of the Cold War and are linked to the weaving of the Latin American political history. The first is built around the national security doctrine, which is shaped by the military dictatorship of South America and later becomes a key element for state crimes during the democratic period in countries such as Mexico and Colombia. Its ideological core is the anti-communist discourse and counter-insurgency strategies directed against the continental guerrillas. This strategy, contemporary to the military imposition of neoliberalism in Chile, is refined and acquires its definitive form with the genocide of indigenous people in Guatemala, a true protophenomenon of the violence that erupts under other modalities and justifications in Mexico. We cannot forget that the military training of the Caibiles elite group took place at the School of the Americas, where the irregular warfare tactics of the professional corps of the Central American states and the dictatorship aligned to the economic policies of the United States were crystallized. Thus, in the genealogy of contemporary war reason, we find anti-communism, the guiding axis of the policy of enmity, which will use the systematic practices of cruel excess on indigenous people, peasants, urban dissidents, and civilians who randomly become military targets of unconventional tactics of the armed conflict. Anti-communism is thus in Latin America, Asia, and Africa the proto-phenomenon of contemporary barbarism. We are talking about the mid-50s and the end of the 90s, the hard years of the Dirty War. The second genealogy, undoubtedly related to the national security doctrine, consists of the starting point marked by September 11, 2001, when, following the regrettable attack on the Twin Towers, the sovereign gesture of a world power opted for a belligerent solution to the conflict, wielding a rhetoric of infinite war against world terrorism. This policy of enmity replaces, as has so often been said, the communist with the global terrorist. The old model of imperialist neocolonialism, still active in Panama, is transformed into the military occupation of the Middle East. The third genealogy, whose capacity for mutation is frankly remarkable, has adapted itself to the previous models and has developed according to an apparently conjunctural logic, but which becomes a third position nonetheless. This is the war on drugs, which has become a hemispheric policy capable of integrating with good fortune both the logic of security and the logic of anti-terrorism. This third form of violence can be randomly adapted to both an authoritarian rhetoric of the state and also works on the devices of the politics of enmity that both models have deployed. Thus, we see how, all too easily, the state's apparent confrontation with drug trafficking are, in fact, criminalization machines of recreational drug users, apparatuses that reduce civil liberties under the pretext of security and the state's legal mechanisms of militarization of public forces and civilian state institutions. These mutations of the state apparatuses have not required coups d'etat in the longest-lived democratic structures of the continent and, at the same time, have galvanized the militaristic currents that remain in the social tendencies of post-dictatorship nations. Thus, we could speak of true peace crimes in formerly democratic countries that have entered into the dynamics of the war on drugs. And at the same time, we are confronted with hard ideological nuclei that vindicate the political legacies of the most atrocious military dictatorship in recent history, such as the last election of Jair Bolsonaro and the refusal of a new constitution in Chile has demonstrated. Both scenarios, the survival of dictatorial impulses and the gross violations of human rights in countries without declared war, are examples of the harmful tendencies that are part of the war reason, as we have called it here. It is once again the grid of intelligibility of political relations, which, far from understanding disagreements and conflicts as factors inherent to the plurality of our societies, seeks to suffocate antagonism through armed confrontation, a form of authoritarian substitution of public debate, which has the need to generate agreements and practices of rational communicative justification. Warlike reason is imperious, self-referential, and authoritarian. It simply does not admit debates or arguments. It always speaks with the weight of urgent evidence. Its language is the slogan of the imperative statement, there are no nuances. It is absolute and emphatic. At the beginning of this conference, we spoke of the paradoxical character of war reason. This lies, to put it clearly, in the fact that from being a subtype of political reason, it has become, by a metonymic twist, practically the only form of understanding politics in the world. War is the political ontology of our century. It is no longer a question here of the armed aspect of public life. Now it is public life that has become an appendage of war reason. Even civil institutions have been hijacked by the preponderance of the military complex, to the extent that public life is in danger of losing all its civic meaning to become the repository of the military fund. In this respect, it will be relevant to study how socialist countries deal with the ravages of war reason and its insidious devices. We will have this conversation tomorrow, precisely. In order to finish the lecture, I would like to, how many time do I have?
If you want to continue, please, 5 more minutes or 10.
Well, thank you so much. 16. States are becoming increasingly empty legal shells, setting political power to its double, military power. Susan Buckmars, for example, has spoken of a wild sound of power that will be the double of publicly recognized political power. Unlike the latter, its wild double will not be under public scrutiny or have an institutional constraint capable of regulating its excess. Slavoj Žižek has spoken of the obscene supplement of the law in another way. The Slovenian author uses the example of the captain of a ship. If the captain of the ship wanted to enforce all the publicly acknowledged rules and nothing but them, eliminating all convention within his crew, which includes the entire repertoire of the practices of vexation, subjugation, and pettiness that, in fact, make the ship run, our captain will not take long to face an inevitable mutiny, because, in fact, it is all those small and microscopic abuses that make the daytime command of the ship work. In other words, publicly recognized and consensual power is based on practices of humiliation and subjugation implicit in the social hierarchy that are maintained every day. Public order always has its opposite side. It is necessary to understand in our critical theory that the state produces its excess and entropies, its constant and growing exceptionality. The excess phagocytize the juridical logic of the state. It is its prop and can always turn against the helmsman, against the public scrutiny and its institutional weakness. This is why it is not necessarily to uphold, like George Agamben, a metaphysics of the state of exception, describing it erroneously, from my point of view, as the only form of global governance. There is no state of exception that has become the rule of world or government because there is no world state that enforces its law over domestic sovereignties. On the contrary, there is a diversity of powers that we can describe according to the general and more specific diagram in historical terms of the war reason. States then produce their own excess, their obscene supplement. 17th. On the other hand, war reason only makes sense as a hypothesis if we understand it not from a metaphysical perspective, but according to the modern, colonial, gendered world system conception. As Immanuel Wallerstein has shown, it is important to consider modernity as a long process. For the American sociologist, capitalism is a historical system that has a structure, a complex of meanings, and a web of relations that we can call the world. In this sense, capitalism is a complex world system of a long-lived historical formation. Aníbal Quijano, the Peruvian sociologist, proposes the term coloniality to better understand the systemic genesis of capitalism. For this is a constitutive element of modernity and not just a secondary factor. In this sense, coloniality constitutes a long-lasting pattern of domination capable of surviving the exhaustion of historical colonialism as it continues to shape the geopolitical relations of the modern colonial world system. The coloniality is expressed in at least 4 registers: the coloniality of power, of knowledge, of being, and of nature. The Argentine philosopher Maria Lugones has shown that, in addition to these factors, we should include the coloniality of gender, but the latter will not be a particular aspect within the general scheme of the coloniality of power. It will be constitutive, that is to say, there is no gender experience that is not Eurocentric, insofar as gender has been the biopolitics for the binary classification of societies based on the colonial experience. In this sense, the modern colonial world system is always a gender system, and this factor is fundamental to understand that the hierarchical organizations of societies has depended precisely on the constant of gender in post-colonial relations. Within this system, and complementing Aníbal Quijano's thesis, we have to admit that the circulation of weapons, which is one of the most complex and irregular markets in the world, is a key element to fully understand the coloniality of power. We simply cannot explain the coloniality without tracing the networks of distribution, buying and selling and manufacturing of weapons, as well as the legal, ethical, and political responsibility of weapon manufacturers. The war reason depends on the weapon market and weapon trafficking to operate in its capitalistic logic of the biomarket, paid homicides and human trafficking, and the militarization of public institutions. 18. Thus, the weapon market is part of the coloniality of power. This is evidenced by the fact that the weapon-producing companies are concentrated in the northern hemisphere, while the distribution sites are primarily in the southern hemisphere. The countries that manufacture weapons and military intelligence technology do not only export armaments, they export war. This market is as criminal as the troops who exert violence through paramilitary strategies, operatives, and irregular warfare schemes. There is simply no war without a weapon market, which is why the militarization efforts must not only focus on the effects of violence, but must also trace the financing money and sources that are the sine qua non of the death politics. Not only states, but also corporations are responsible for the massacres of civilians that take place in our regions. 19th, thus, war reason is a device that is simultaneously shaped by patriarchy and its hyper-violent forms of masculinity, the logic of increasing value in capitalism, the practices of population, racialization, and the dimensions of ableism that affect the vulnerability of the bodies of the members of society. Without these components, it is impossible to explain the persistence of armed conflict in our region, a persistence that, it is evident, could not have been maintained without the international weapon market. Any progress towards post-conflict social scenarios seems impossible without international regulation of this market, for the social responsibility of companies in the gross violation of human rights of societies immersed in and subjected to armed conflict is well established. Perhaps the best way to structure these social justice processes, beyond the grammar and politics of forgiveness, is to begin their overall design by appealing to the principle of all affects, a basic principle of social justice proposed by Nancy Fraser as part of her tripartite theory of justice. This extension of representation to those affected which includes, of course, the direct and indirect victims of armed conflicts, can be the pillar of transitional justice practices of great importance in the efforts to clarify the facts and the search for alternatives that lead to peace processes. Fraser poses the problem in terms of a new post-Westphalian framework of international relations that could make parity of participation and the principle of all concerned possible. Both criteria allow for a much more substantialist political understanding than the option for discourse ethic or contemporary liberal frameworks, while rejecting the relativist implication of Anglo-Saxon communitarism. Fraser's approach of a parity of participation would most likely be a viable global criterion for the constitution of new normative practices of justice. Fraser herself narrows her approach into three main areas. Parity is predicated on a political representation, economic redistribution, and cultural recognition. Fraser's principle of all those affected can open interesting avenues of political participation that go beyond the sovereign politics of nation states via social movements and their more flexible forms of organization. This makes it possible to understand the emergence of new international cooperation and solidarity figures based on social mobilization and not on state initiatives. Undoubtedly, a normative principle of this type is essential to provide a social counterweight to the unrestricted sale of weapons to criminal groups. 20 and last thesis, we made it. From 1964 to 2022, 100,000 people have disappeared in Mexico, according to UN figures. According to figures from the Centro ProDH, disappearances reach up to 300,000. A quarter of the people who have disappeared are women, and 20% were barely of age when they were victims of forced disappearance. Since 2006, during Felipe Calderón's term in office, forced disappearances have increased exponentially as Mexico declared war on drugs. Since the 1970s, the army and police forces began to systematically disappear people involved in the guerrilla, especially in the state of Guerrero, and also leaders, mainly indigenous, who defend natural resources. Since 2006, the modalities of forced disappearance have escalated to terrifying figures and images. Most of the victims of the crossfire between drug cartels and state forces are young men. But both the army and the drug cartels exert a terrible power over the bodies of women, mainly Central America or Mexican migrant women living in poverty. We must not forget that the militaristic culture is also a patriarchal culture and that the control of the territory implies controlling the female body and sexuality. In order to fight violence, some indigenous and peasant communities have turned to autonomy and self-defense. The community police in Guerrero and the self-defense groups in Michoacán are an example of this. Others have become involved in political militancy, in political parties or activist networks. The truth is that many officers and military officers are also colluded with organized crime, as the case of the 43 Ayotzinapa students has demonstrated. While conservative groups in Mexico are betting on the iron fist to solve the problem, we know that this has only increased the violence rates in the country, which are practically war figures. As I have argued elsewhere, fighting violence requires improving the economic conditions of Mexico's poor majority, promoting full citizenship and political participation, guaranteeing public education, health services, water, and full employment throughout the country. The causes of violence, which include the extreme poverty of 40% of Mexicans, must be dealt with. It is also necessary to demilitarize the security policy and bring to justice the main perpetrators of armed violence in the country, as well as to encourage an amnesty program and offer compensation for the victims. Finally, it will be necessary to move towards a horizon where forensic justice, in addition to restorative justice schemes, could be possible. By forensic justice, I mean the policy of restitution, compensation, and return of the mortal remains to the families of their loved ones whose lives have been lost in the midst of the political and humanitarian catastrophes caused by war reason. Only this ontological certainty of the remains could be the basis for a general policy of peacemaking and probably reconciliation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Hernández. You were mentioning in the first part of your lecture the grammar of war and the syntax of cruelty as first approach to war reason. And of course, we need to understand what's going on in this global war in some way we are facing. The Zapatista movement calls the fourth world war, what we are facing today, right? So thank you so much for inviting us to reflect in a philosophical way about the grammar of war. Listening to you before reading the text and then listening this moment, I remembered a community of people in Texcoco, in the Central Valley in Mexico City. They are fighting for preserving the lake, and we were working with them what we call narratives of resistance. And then we asked them, how would you describe the evil that you are facing? And they said, there is a beast. We are facing the beast, which is the big city, controlling everything and trying in some way to destroy the lake. The immigrants also called the beast, the train crossing Mexican territory from southern border Guatemala to the northern part, right? So, and you mentioned also the monstra, per monstra ad astra. So the role of this imagination, talking about the evil in some different ways, we using different metaphors, of course. And that reminds me a theological category, which was proposed by St. Paul, the apostle and particular disciple of St. Paul, the katejon. Katejon is like a monster, is a figure of a character who is in some way avoiding the end of history and in some way extending the experience of suffering. And the Messiah will come to defeat katejon in some way. So different narratives, all the narratives in the Bible, but also contemporary narratives from the survivors, like in Texcoco, and the categories of philosophers that you have mentioned, like, of course, Sayak Valencia and the Endriagos. Thank you so much for this wonderful insight about a kind of rationality. We need to understand the war reason. We open the floor now for 2 rounds of conversations, and then, of course, we say in this way, congratulations, thank you so much. I will explain briefly the way of proceeding now. 2 rounds, first of all in Spanish and with your students in the classroom. And then Martin Aguilera will make a synthetic synthesis of this conversation. And then we will continue a second round of questions and comments from the people connected on Zoom. So first of all, we will introduce the group at the UNAM. Vamos a proceder con los compañeros de la UNAM a una primera ronda de comentarios o preguntas que quieran dirigirle en español o en inglés, si quieren, al profesor Hernández. Él responderá en español. Es una conversación más del grupo local. Aquí haremos una traducción al inglés para el grupo que está conectado, si bien todos somos la mayoría bilingües, pero para la grabación que después verán otras personas es importante mantener también el inglés como una lengua común. Entonces la segunda parte será la conversación de personas en Zoom en inglés. Profesor Donovan, si quiere usted conversar con el grupo en la UNAM.
Perfecto, muchas gracias. Pues bueno, aquí tenemos un grupo de estudiantes. No sé si tengan algún comentario. Una pregunta solamente. ¿Escuchan ustedes a los estudiantes? No.
A ti te escuchamos bien, Donovan.
Si quieres acá, tal vez. Como les estoy dando para que puedan acercarse al micrófono.
Así, eso parece bien. Pero no te escuchamos.
¿Puedes hablar más fuerte, tal vez? Sí.
No.
Bueno, no. A ver, ahí acércate y habla un poquito más fuerte. Listo. Ajá.
No, lamentablemente no te escuchamos.
Pero basta con que el profesor Donovan repita la pregunta.
Perfecto.
Ya,
claro.
tal vez tú repites la pregunta.
Listo,
Sí.
la repito. Sí.
Para porque él no quiere que te contara,
Ujú.
pero no entiendo esa cultura.
Claro.
Porque
Claro. Plantean una pregunta que tiene que ver con la historia, la anécdota que cuenta Rosana Reguillo en su reciente libro, eh, que les mostraba acerca de un joven sicario que, imaginando su propia muerte, ¿no? A solicitud de su entrevistadora, dice que se imagina su muerte como si él estuviera, que lo descuarticen básicamente, ¿no? Que lo hagan pedacitos para que su madre no tenga que entrar en duelo, no tenga que tener la incertidumbre de sus restos, ¿no? Es más o menos esta la idea. Y la pregunta tiene que ver con, bueno, claro, la magnitud dramática de esta imagen y cómo una persona tan joven, ¿no? Como este sicario, digamos, puede llegar a imaginar esta solicitud como una especie de alegoría justamente de una muerte sin duelo, ¿no? Una muerte que no deje huella, una muerte que de alguna manera se borre a sí misma, tal vez, ¿no? Y desde mi punto de vista tiene que ver con el hecho de que este joven, lo que ocurre con él, es que es muy claramente consciente de la propia enajenación de la que él es víctima y dentro del sistema en el que él está involucrado, ¿no? Esto es, reconoce una autoridad por encima de él, una autoridad que es tal por el hecho de que tiene las armas, de que tiene el dinero, de que tiene recursos, ¿no? Para cometer este tipo de atrocidades y salir impune. Y al mismo tiempo él se ve a sí mismo como un engranaje dentro de esta maquinaria, ¿no? Un poco lo que me parece fundamental de esto es mostrar cómo este tipo de personalidad ciertamente es una personalidad autoritaria porque reconoce una autoridad en última instancia que confunde la instancia entre el derecho y los hechos consumados, entre de facto y de jure, decíamos, ¿no? Y esta instancia es justamente la figura de un soberano, de una especie de supuesto soberano que sería en este caso, pues, la cabeza del grupo delictivo, ¿no? Esto me hace pensar muchas veces en aquella vieja imagen que nos ha heredado Hegel al pensar sobre la Revolución Francesa y la violencia de la Revolución Francesa, cuando Hegel dice que la muerte es el amo absoluto, ¿no? Esta especie de figura que consume y devora todo, podríamos decir, ¿no? Una especie de soberanía excesiva, como una especie de soberanía que no establece, digamos, reglas de convivencia, reglas y normativas del campo, sino que más bien subsume, devora, ¿no? Aniquila en el proceso de consumarse, podríamos decir. Entonces, esto es un poco lo que estaba tratando yo de indicar, ¿no? Con esta figura de el gesto soberano. He hablado del gesto soberano, que para mí tiene que ver no solo con una economía sacrificial en el orden religioso o teológico, como sea que lo entendamos, que ciertamente es el caso, pero que también tiene una traducción hacia el campo, digamos, seglar, ¿no? Como de la praxis política. Esto es, esta función de soberanía excesiva es también un exceso que va más allá de lo sagrado y que entra a jugar dentro del campo de las relaciones seculares, ¿no? Y en ese sentido, por supuesto, los estados pueden ejecutar un gesto soberano cuando pueden condenar a muerte a otras personas, en los estados en que así es el caso, y no necesariamente el gesto soberano se concentra únicamente en la jurisdicción estatal. Ahora lo que vemos es que distintos grupos armados pueden ejecutar el gesto soberano de desmembrar, de sacrificar, de, digamos, gastar recursos en una manera que parece irracional, gastar vidas, gastar campo, gastar recursos materiales, gastar recursos económicos, ¿no? Gastar recursos armamentísticos, ¿no? Y que justamente esta forma del gasto, esta forma del exceso es lo que me parece una de las claves para comprender la soberanía, no solo en un terreno teológico, sino también político, que me parece ahí, que me parece uno de los puntos clave para el argumento.
Gracias, Donovan. ¿Alguna otra comentario o pregunta en tu sala?
¿Tienen otro comentario? Bueno, a ver, parece que hay una pregunta que están haciendo. We have a question to be born. Por favor. A ver,
O tú repítela mejor, lo hacemos como ya
lo repito, la repito, si quieres cuéntamela ahí.
Fuerzas policiales son civiles, militares son militares, y hablaban de cómo las fuerzas militares a los civiles. Entonces, el problema no es en sí que exista un grupo militar, ¿no? Pero sí, el grupo militar no es algo que encierra una lógica de ver de no responder.
Ok, muy bien. Bien, la pregunta que plantea Jimena, también estudiante de nuestro proyecto, es la siguiente. Está relacionada con la división de la que hablaba, ¿no? Entre instituciones civiles e instituciones militares, ¿no? Por ejemplo, fuerzas policíacas y fuerzas del ejército armado, ¿no? Y ella un poco lo que plantea es, si no entiendo mal, que yo trato de mostrar que actualmente hay una forma de subsunción, que esto es justamente la razón bélica de la que hablo, ¿no? Que está subsumiendo las funciones de los poderes civiles dentro de el gran complejo militar. Lo que ella plantea es que tal vez el problema no es que haya esta división, sino que existe un complejo militar, existe un grupo armado, ¿no? Y tal vez eso es lo problemático en sí. Aunque tendencialmente yo estoy de acuerdo con este punto de vista, me parece que, digamos, un mínimo principio de realidad tal vez nos obligaría a reconocer que la existencia de los ejércitos en el mundo contemporáneo tiene cierto sentido, problemático, y eso es algo que tenemos que discutir, ciertamente, cuál es su alcance, cuál es la relevancia. Evidentemente, en un mundo en paz no sería deseable el ejército, yo estoy de acuerdo, pero no parece que estemos en esa condición. lo que actualmente estoy tratando de mostrar es que, a diferencia de los modelos del neoliberalismo, digamos, en sus orígenes en América Latina, que se impuso a base de golpes de Estado, con un ejército robusto que, digamos, sometió los poderes civiles a la lógica militar, lo que tenemos es ahora ya no un proceso de transición abrupto, sino más bien un proceso de transición suave, podríamos decir, ¿no? Que está modelado en términos jurídicos. Hay una cesión jurídica, ¿no? De cada vez más potestades a el ejército. Y esto que parece que el ejército solamente tiene más facultades ampliadas dentro de un ámbito constitucional en donde están definidos previamente sus reglas del juego y las normas en las cuales estos pueden actuar, lo que vemos ahora es que se está revirtiendo. Lo que tenemos es un complejo militar que está subsumiendo cada vez más a las instituciones civiles. Por ejemplo, cuando se trata de la construcción de megaproyectos en el sureste del país, ¿no? Esto que podrían ser infraestructura civil es ahora, digamos, fundamentalmente construida por el ejército o el propio, los aeropuertos, digamos, zonas federales que cada vez están siendo más absorbidas por la función militar, a tal grado que parece que ahora las funciones de las instituciones civiles son un apéndice del gran complejo y el funcionamiento militar, que se convierte no solo ya en la coraza defensiva del Estado, sino, digamos, en la parte sustancial del Estado, ¿no? Esa me parece en gran parte la transición en la que nos encontramos. Cierto que no solamente en México, pero particularmente es una coyuntura en la que me parece que México se encuentra.
Gracias, profesor Donovan. Y ahora Martín Aguilera hará una síntesis no de las dos preguntas completas y las respuestas, sino de la conversación. Adelante, Martín.
Well, the conversation that we were just having with Professor Donovan, and I think the people that asked the questions, was related to, first of all, the understanding of the image of a person that, when things about his death, does not count with the aspect of grief. How is it possible for that to happen? How is it that someone can imagine his death without grief, without anyone taking care of his body? And Professor Donovan took this image and related it to the relation of sovereignty, the concept of sovereignty, and how the way in which the states are spending the money and resources is a metaphor, or can be explained with this metaphor. He says that the excess in the way of spending is key to understanding the sovereignty idea. This was the dialogue on the relation both ideas. Then the second question brought us to the conversation around the integrating of military presence in the structures of the state functions, and how the warrism is eating the state policies, eating out the state policies.
Thank you so much, Martin. Now we proceed to the second round. It's a conversation continuing here. People were connected on Zoom. I would invite people who would like to raise some questions or comments. Perhaps Professor Nancy Pineda-Madrid, you would like to enter into a conversation. Professor Nancy Pineda-Madrid, she's a theologian, professor at Loyola Marymount University, and you have been working several years on violence against women, particularly, right?
Yes.
This book about suffering and salvation in Ciudad Juarez, and then theologizing in an insurgent key, violence, women, and salvation. So I'm sure that you have a lot of comments and questions to share with us. And Professor Donovan, please.
Yes, thank you, Carlos. And Professor Donovan, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm really appreciative of what you've offered us here. And I have some observations for you. One of them is, you know, as I was reading your work and your use of political power throughout this piece, got me thinking about the various ways we understand politics. And I feel like I want to suggest to you a distinction in terms of the political, a distinction between political power as authoritarian and dictatorial, which of course is present throughout your work here. And that's exactly what you're describing in the ascent of that and the pervasiveness of it, which clearly is here. But also to understand the political as an art that we use to avoid violence or to seek a way forward that resolves conflict rather than a devolution into violence. And that kind of an understanding of the political is also part of what provides hope for us. And so I was wanting to see the distinction there, because when you use the political as an ontology, I wanted to see, I understand the ontology in terms of war and the rhetoric, and I see that. But I also was interested in seeing kind of this tension between that and politics as an antidote to violence that I also want to hold on to. The other thing that I wanted to talk about and draw forward from your work is that throughout the entire piece, you're talking about what destroys our humanity and destroys that makes us human, and which, as I read your whole piece, you know, the destruction of empathy, the destruction of imagination, the destruction of critical thinking, the destruction of the ability to feel. And I think all of those pieces are really very important. And the destruction too, in your discussion of Arendt, the capacity for judgment. And I want to push you on what you did with Arendt here, because of course her work on the banality of evil, part of that I think is so interesting about what she's doing is she talks about evil never being radical in terms of her understanding of the banality. That it's never radical because it can't go deep and it doesn't have roots. So there's that connects into what you're saying in terms of the repression of critical thinking and the repression of a capacity to make judgments. So those are points that for me came forward as I was reading your work. So those are observations I'm making, and wanting you to talk about, you know, just to comment on those, because that's what I took away here. And of course, I'm extremely interested in terms of what you're doing with regard to gender and women, which has been a concern of mine for more than 20 years.
Thank you, Professor Pineda Madrid. And Professor Donovan, would you like to share your thoughts about the two topics raised by Professor Nancy?
Well, there's a lot of questions here in the conceptual order, maybe. So thank you so much, Nancy, for these wonderful questions. Well, I will try to answer both in the next terms. First, I think that in French and maybe in German, we could distinguish this this notion, this concept of power. In French, we could say pouvoir for the institution, the public relations and exercises of power, maybe, and puissance, which is this capacity, this skill, this opportunity we have to maybe resist, maybe reimagine our relations, maybe I don't know, all the capabilities that we could develop in order to enjoy life and make life more potent. Maybe is that what I want to say. And in Spanish, we have this semantic that power and resistance are always related. And what I want to say is that when I call imagination, when I say empathy, when I describe these other aspects of the psychic life that is very rich in order to resist and reimagine our own life in the middle of these violent displaces, violent I don't know, violent devices. We could try to, I try to call them imagination, hope, and maybe the messianic force in a Benjaminian way, this suspension of history in order that history is the catastrophe and so on. And when I speak of power, I clearly speak in a Foucauldian way. I think power as an exercise, as an dispositive, as an economic, a general economic of relations that we implement to produce some kind of subjectivities, some kind of institutions, some kind of mechanisms, political technologies that makes some effects in the social order. And in this sense, well, I how could I say? I agree with you in this. Sorry, I think in Spanish, and then I translate, as the men say. And then, yeah, I agree with you in these terms. I would like to talk about hope in some ways, but this work, this work in which I'm working among the last 3 years, at least, is a reflection about this necropolitics, about this violent displacement on social, on bodies, on female bodies. And then I hope to have the opportunity to speak sooner about the hope, about the imagination, and about all the positive things in life that makes it very appreciated for us. And on the second question about Hannah Arendt, yes, I agree to I have just a different approach, because I think that Hannah Arendt is a very close reader to Kant philosophy, political philosophy. And one of the things that Hannah Arendt works on Kantian philosophy, is precisely the concept of imagination. I mean, how important is imagination for the Kantian reflection on political, the capacity of judgment that makes an alternative to this banality of evil, precisely. And yes, of course, the evil is not radical. Maybe just love, she says in some letters, but not the evil. The evil cannot be radical. And this is interesting. If love is a question of authority, of a question of responsibility for the world, as she says in different parts of their books, of their work, of her work, sorry. If this is the question for Hannah Arendt, then the imagination is a fundamental aspect for the political judgment. And the political judgment is a fundamental aspect for the a life without violence. And maybe this is the question we have today. I mean, this is a global question we have we are in the middle of these questions. I mean, how could we imagine a world without war violence, a world without violence, a world with hope, a world with this imagination as an fundamental aspect for the communities, for the construction of the social life, for the construction of a new ethics maybe. But in this respect, I think that unfortunately, violence is one aspect that we can't just, how could I say, erase from our horizon, no? Because the violence maybe is something constitutive for our social ontology, for our political ontology. And that is another aspect of your question that I would like to speak, is just this. I don't think that the power is an ontology, but I think that we have a historical ontology of the ways that the power conforms in our social lives. And then I think that we have a political ontology, but I don't make an ontology of power, because I don't think that this constitution of the power is a historical or eternal. I think is a historical formation, and we could change that. That is.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and that's kind of the distinction I was, pointing to and hoping to hear. I also want to say one thing. One thing that the Spanish language has that's a huge advantage over English is that poder, the word poder, which is power, right? In English, when we say power, it's a noun, so it's considered a kind of quantity. You have power or you don't have power. And it's seen in that way, where in Spanish, there's a massive advantage because poder, of course, is a verb. And so it goes to exactly what you were describing about the creation. We can create different circumstances and situations. And I think that's huge. And maybe part of the poverty in English is that we can talk about that, but we don't, it's not shaped in our imagination when we use the word power, because that's not how, because power in itself is not seen as a verb. So I would say that. And I'm curious, I appreciate at the end here in your point 20 that you talked about what happens in terms of power over women's bodies and how women's bodies become the terrain upon which power is exercised. And, I think that's an incredibly important insight. And I really look forward to that developing and being deepened in your thinking, because I think that's absolutely critical. And you see people like Melissa Wright, who has a whole discussion of the maquiladoras in Mexico and the mujeres desechables. So there's a whole discourse of the mujeres desechables, which is linking into what you're describing here. So that's very rich. Thank you. I'll stop. I could go on and on, but I'll stop.
Thank you, Dr. Nancy. And I would like just to jump in talking about poder in Spanish. And we have another word in Spanish, potencia, which is an inner power coming from the inner self, I would like to say, and transforming realities. So it's probably related to the potency of the victims that become in some way survivors through resistances and resiliency. So I think the colonial thinking is trying to keep in mind this kind of distinction. And I would like to also just to mention how important it would be to continue your thoughts, reflection, Dr. Donovan, with connecting with phenomenology. Phenomenology, there are some authors in France, for instance, Emmanuel Falk, he's at the Institut Catholique de Paris, and he's working on what he called the extra phenomenon. Is what's following the trauma studies, people who are facing in some way trauma. How can we talk about phenomenology in that case. There is extra meaning. It's not only a kind of experience of a phénomène saturé. It's not a kind of excess of meaning. There's a lack of meaning in some way. And there is a different side of history that is at work in the experience of the victims resisting and then facing trauma. So I think it would be very interesting at the connection with necropolitics and the war reason, extending the reflection on the phenomenological way. So it's a provocation because you're a philosopher and I know you will continue working on that. So yeah, why not? We as theologians, we are of course interested in this kind of experience, distinguishing and connecting necropolitics, but also how there is a kind of subjectivities working against necropolitics in their own bodies, in their wounded bodies, and the potency coming from them is transforming history. That's the theological perspective that I would like to improve with other colleagues like Professor Nancy Pineda Madrid and some other in different contexts. Latinx theology is working on that a little bit, I guess. And that's why I just wanted to share with you these thoughts. If there is somebody else, we have just a few minutes left to conclude, 2 or 3 minutes. Some other here in the chat would like to make some comments.
If nobody else has something, I could go again, but I you know, I've already spoken, but I'll jump in on.
Go ahead, please.
Okay, I think another point for your paper that I found really interesting is the underlying theme of fear and how fear gets manipulated. And I think that that's also at the heart of the violence that's being done here, is the use and the manipulation of fear and the deepening of fear, right? But between, you know, if you look at the feminicides, initially early on, you have bodies that are being buried. And then, you know, today, the desapariciones, or the disappearances, are much more prevalent. And I think the question then becomes, you know, how to deepen the terror and the traumas, picking up on what Carlos was, Professor Mendoza was just talking about, Professor Carlos. There's a deepening of the trauma and a terrorizing that goes far deeper with the desapariciones. And I think that's something that we need to attend to. It was interesting in this narrative that we were just speaking about earlier about the young man who claims that if his body is chopped up somehow, you know, that will decrease his mother's, you know, his mother will be able to mourn in a different kind of way without a body. And there's a lot that is written on the fact that no, in fact, without a body, the terror is far deeper. You know, what we learned from Argentina and the dirty war in Argentina, right? And all the and then the disappearance, the desapariciones, of course, in Mexico today, which is horrific. So anyway, that's another comment that struck me as I read what you were discussing in this paper.
Professor Donovan, there is another person, Martin, would like to say something, and then you can make a general comment before closing the session today. Please go ahead, Martin.
Just a small comment. Thank you, Professor Donovan, for your presentation. It's a sort of a point and a question at the same time with the reference to what happened with the new constitution in Chile. I'm Chilean, and it's been a very interesting phenomena to observe the vast majority that voted against the new constitution, because there's a logic within this new constitution that was not compatible with most of the people who voted. And I believe that you point out somehow that without going deeper into it, because, you know, we as a population, we had the opportunity to make things different, but maybe fear, maybe, remnants of the doctrine of development or the security of government. And there's been a sort of balance from the new government after the rejection of the new constitution that has gone towards policies of security and militarization of the country, which is actually a lot interesting with what you were just saying, right? Because the president have said it many times. We went from rejecting the new constitution that talked with a new logic, the colonial thinking and ecology, towards the president talking to the people saying that the main focus and constant task of the current government is to give people security through militarization.
Professor Donovan, would you like to connect the three different comments we've made?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions. We need some 2 hours, more hours, maybe.
Oh, please.
Well, I begin with the last point around Chile, and this circumstance we have. In fact, I did a video to support the Boric candidacy with some other collectives, and in this project Arde Chile 2, in which we have a collaboration with Slavoj Žižek and Duane Russell that make an psychoanalytic approach to these questions. And yes, I think we must study this more deeper, but I could say that I think my best approach is that there is this tendency of the state, this immanent tendency of the state to reproduce itself. The state tends to reproduce itself. It's a question of about the give me a moment. About the duration. Sorry, I searched for some words here. It is a question of temporal duration, but also a question of historical duration of these logics. And when we have a military dictatorship that makes the most constitutional engineering of the country, we certainly have this tendency of the own state to preserve this heritage, to preserve this I don't know, this logic of organization of power relationships into them. And I think that I don't think that it's just a question of just a candidate. I think that the social movement in Chile has won some things, some valuable things, some valuable aspects, but I think that it is not just a question of the quality of the policy of the streets. I think that we must have institutional transformations too. And that is where I think that this approach of Nancy Fraser for the tripartite justice, her tripartite theory of justice, is important and relevant to us, because when we think that the parity of participation is relevant for those who has not traditional participation in the state business, I think that that is precisely the opportunity, the puissance, la potencia, where all the people can make an approach to transform their own circumstances. And yes, I in this respect, I am a traditional Marxist. I think that the oppressed have the best interest in their liberation. and yes, I think that, but if we want liberation, we must wish it. And I think we must work on that wish. We must work on that desire for liberation that is an exercise of liberation itself. And
thank you so much, Professor Donovan. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time. The time is over, but we will continue this conversation, of course, in different projects at the UNAM here in Boston College, and we will continue creating networks. I think it's absolutely important. Probably California also could be a place to continue the conversation, and we really appreciate very much, and we are so grateful for your thoughts, your thinking, your very serious way of trying to go deeper, to connect different ideas, thoughts about politics. So we really appreciate very much. And I open the floor now. Martin, would you like to just announce the next conference, the colloquium next week?
We appreciate so much everyone that was able to make it to this some part of our conference. And just remembering everyone that this is the first session of the fall colloquium, as well as part of the Semillero in UNAM. We will continue with our next sessions of the fall colloquium next week, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. All of them, Wednesday and Thursday from 6 to 8, and on Friday will be from 4 to 6 Boston time. We will have our Professor João César de Castro Rocha joining us from Brazil, and we will keep discussing on topics related to what we talked today. So we hope you all can make it. This will be a hybrid mode. We'll have online transmission to Facebook and always in-person conversations.
Thank you very much. So all the best, my friends. Thank you, and bravo, Professor Donovan Hernández, for your wonderful lecture. And all the people at the UNAM, greetings, saludos a todos allá en la UNAM, gracias y hasta pronto. Nos vemos la próxima semana.
Ciao.
Thank you. Bye bye. Ciao.
Thank you.